think one of the big challenges that we face is that we've created an institutional framework which is all focused on control, and we've created an institutional logic which is all focused on both control, distancing, and separation. So whether it's the birth of perspective or classification theory, these were all things about division and separation and objectification. And that worldview kind of maybe could be argued worked in a theory where we saw humans as in dominion of the world. And it maybe kind of worked in a worldview where we were not so perceptibly entangled. And I think one of the challenges that we face is that worldview is no longer viable, and the feedbacks and our entanglements are material, i.e., whether it's CO2, whether it's plastics, or whether it's even social violence, these entanglements are no longer divisible and ignorable. They are feedbacking, and that entanglement actually thereby drives exactly the worldview that you're driving.
Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Indy Johar. Indy is an architect and co-founder of Dark Matter Labs, an organization focused on building the novel institutional infrastructure necessary to make societies centered on interdependence, equality, and justice a reality. He's lectured at various institutions, including University College London, Princeton, Harvard, and MIT, and he's held various positions such as advisor to the Mayor of London on good growth. He also co-founded 00, a collaborative studio that innovates in the design space, for example by creating an open source solution to housing, their wikihouse. Through 00, he's also co-founded multiple social ventures in the UK, such as Impact Hub Westminster and Impact Hub Birmingham. Today, we focus on his work on civic infrastructure that could underpin a future of flourishing for humanity. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Indy Johar. Indy, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Honored to be here. Delighted. Thanks, James.
Yeah. Great to have you. So maybe we can begin with a bit about your background in your own words before we dive into these different topics.
Yeah, really simple. I trained as an architect and then really went on a journey of how do we build our places in cities? How do we build our places in cities to be deeply democratic? And by democracy, I don't mean just the vote. I mean the agency to make societies with care. And how do we distribute that agency to make societies and places with care? And that's really been the journey. I was part of building, Impact Hub with people like Jonathan Robertson, was part of building Open Desk and wikihouse and 00, and then last sort of nearly 8 years been building Dark Matter Labs. So yeah, it's been a bit of a journey.
Yeah, I really like that definition of democracy as kind of empowering agency. So to share a bit about where I'm coming from and why your work resonates, because I have a very different background studying neuroscience, and I became interested in neuroscience because of an interest in the mind. But then I realized I think a lot of the mind is really to do with the kind of biophysics of being a living embodied thing, and so I became very interested in agency, in that the things we really care about as living things is our ability to be free and to flourish and to be kind of harmoniously aligned with the world around us. And then because we're not truly separate individuals as organisms, there's also this kind of superorganism layer of us as a social primate species. Then care and how we support each other is really fundamental to us moving towards freedom at this individual level. So I think these themes of kind of human flourishing and how do we organize collectively to empower ourselves to live freely and with maximum agency seems to really align with where you're coming from, even though technically you have a different background. Does that sound like there's an alignment there?
Yeah, no, well, I think you've actually put it better than I would. I think I totally come to very similar locations. I think one of the big challenges that we face is that we've created an institutional framework which is all focused on control, and we've created an institutional logic which is all focused on both control, distancing, and separation. So whether it's the birth of perspective or classification theory, these are all things about division and separation and objectification. And that worldview kind of maybe could be argued worked in a theory where we saw humans as in dominion of the world, and it maybe kind of worked in a worldview where we were not so perceptibly entangled. And I think one of the challenges that we face is that worldview is is no longer viable, and the feedbacks and entanglements are material, i.e., whether it's CO2, whether it's plastics, or whether it's social violence, these entanglements are no longer divisible and ignorable. They are feedbacking, and that entanglement actually thereby drives exactly the worldview that you're driving. And I think what it also throws up is a very interesting question about entangled sovereignties, right? So, this kind of interbeing conversation where it is I'm in function, I'm embodied function with my relationships, as opposed to being divisible from those relationships. And I think that challenges all our notions of individuality or isolationability, and it challenges everything about it. And that, I think the crisis that we face is that our institutional frameworks are based on divisibility, isolation, individualism, yet actually our comprehensions and our beingness is fundamentally different. And that is the apex of the crisis, fundamentally. Everything else is a symptom. I think CO2 is a symptom, climate change is a symptom of that systemic failure, which is manifesting everywhere.
Right. And to get to this point where we have a culture that is so focused on the individual with this illusory sense of the individual as truly separate, not as as not entangled, not interdependent with other things. Given that we are interdependent and we are entangled with everything else, the wise thing, the way to live in a kind of harmonious, flourishing way, appears to be aware of that and to structure things in line with that, which is the work that you're doing, the kind of nitty gritty on. And how do we do that as a civilization? And so, as someone with a psychological background, it's I've always been fascinated by how did we come to such an unwise place, where we have this this version of individualism that's so misaligned with reality that it causes all these neurotic side effects, as you say, like CO2 and mass poverty, and the migrations that we'll see with climate change, people being displaced from their homes, like all of this chaos. And it feels to me like a kind of almost a way creatures act that way in a very short-termist, self-focused, kind of individualistic way when they're really kind of under a lot of stress and they're just trying to kind of survive moment to moment. So I think there's probably a story to be told about collective trauma and just the huge stress that kind of, I imagine life in the Middle Ages wasn't much fun, and I can see why people kind of ended up with this unwise short-termist culture emerging. But now we're in a place where I think we can cultivate the wisdom to start to move into this broader vision, this more long-term, wise, holistic picture of how do we organize in a way that's aligned with these principles. And I think you're right that so let's start with some of these issues, and the worldview that gives rise to them, right? Because people often will approach things like climate change as a narrowly defined, separate issue, but these things are entirely entangled with everything else.
Yeah, and I think, as you rightly point out, I think there's a book called The Wounding Machine. I'm not sure we're just living through the historic trauma and a kind of extrapolation of historic traumas. I think we've created a machine which is designed to consistently wound in order to perpetuate a sort of an economic extractive model. And I know that sounds pretty dark, but what I'm trying to get to is that if you want to instrumentalize people, and our economy is fundamentally a theory of instrumentalization. So, you will say, unemployment figures, that's basically not instrumentalized sufficiently. So our productivity figures, these are all theories of instrumentalization. And actually what we don't put is the discrepancy of that language with the discrepancy of democracy. These are kind of convenient pass-throughs in the night, when actually what we have is a dominant model of dominion, control, and those relationships. And the employment contract is an extension of those relationships. They're an extension of command and control figures and command. So what we have is an economic thesis, and the nature of the work that we've constructed is actually in the relationship of work that we've constructed, which is largely about perpetuating the wounding. And in the act of perpetuating the wounding, we look for a synthetic salve, which is consumption. So we have this sort of double lock-in where our industrial economy is actually perpetuating the wounding. In order to solve that, we effectively look at consumption, and our consumption is not a consumption of of making our lives better. It's a consumption to heal the self, sugar addiction, material consumption, fast fashion. They don't actually make any of our lives better, but what they do is solve the wounds that are generated in our day-to-day work and the social damage that is done to us. So I think this is a kind of we're in this double bind that has created this outcome. And I think in that narrative, the languages like freedom become very powerful. So what we have is a synthetic freedom, a freedom to escape the system. So we objectified this idea that you can become super rich in order to free yourself from the system. So it's a goal to become super rich rather than saying it's a right to be free. So we've ended up instrumentalizing freedom as an objective system, as a kind of infinitely never attainable goal. Because even if you go to people like Elon Musk, he would argue he's not free either. System captures all, I would argue. Is that the freedom is a freedom to escape rather than a freedom to care. And I think this manifests very nuancedly into everything. So even the private contract is a bilateral contract to optimize each one or other positions. It's not a contract of relationship of care. So the kind of thesis of the contract, which actually was the contract assumes divisibility, assumes separation, assumes 2.0. Whereas we know in complex systems, actually what you need is an overarching language of care. And even people like Adam Smith, when he talked about the invisible hand, was actually talking about this invisible underlying, under the market was a subset of a social system, whereas now the market has become a superset of the social system, and thereby what it's become is a theory of extraction and transactions, which are actually which are all about single point optimizations, which are thereby doing the damage, and they don't understand the multiplicity of value or the entanglements in that process.
Absolutely. I think this polarization between care and wounding being the opposites of each other is really important, because wounding seems to arise because often it's not because people are actively seeking sadistic way to harm, but it's just a kind of, it's so banal in the sense that it can just be a withdrawal of empathy and an objectification of the other, whether that's one's own body or the another human or the world around us, other living things. In that objectification, you're just kind of withdrawing subjecthood, withdrawing the empathy that says you're like me, and therefore I'm going to generalize the instincts I have for myself of not wanting to be harmed and have my freedoms taken away. I'm going to generalize that to you because I feel our kinship. You withdraw that, and suddenly now, well, you're an instrument that you're a tool that I can use to exploit for my own personal gain. And so this seems to be the rabbit hole that we tumbled down at some point, the last centuries, millennia.
And it was constructed. And I would just say it was constructed, James. I think whether like you could argue that Newtonian Enlightenment, which was about looking at the world for divisibility, which was really powerful, gave birth to our science as we know it. But it also then gave birth to classification models. Classification as a means of separation, right? Classification is a means. We know that, I may be brown as a kind of melatonin melanin level, and you may be white skinned, but it's utter bullshit in terms of any form of kind of actual. We know there's greater genetic diversity in the continent of Africa than the rest of the planet. So in terms of human genetic diversity. So these classic classification theories were simple models to allow for divisibility and thereby create the permission for that. And I think you're absolutely perfectly acute about saying this, that wounding is not the kind of maliciousness of kind of just getting out the machete. In a way, it's this process of dehumanization, the objectification, the instrumentalization, and thereby does give a pathway to the machete, by the way. So I wouldn't take the machete off the table. It is a pathway to the violence. And we have fallen into that trap. And you could argue World War II, there were some very interesting, very dangerous things that were done through bureaucracy that allowed for the dehumanization of a system sufficiently to create the permission of violence. And we know that was done in the colonization of Africa and other frameworks, in Bangladesh and other frameworks. So these tools of dehumanization have been instrumentalized to the catastrophic sense, but they also exist in our industrial economy. And it does require a deep transformation. And this is why I think one of the big challenges that we face is we often talk about decarbonization of our economies. But actually, unless we marry that with the rehumanization of our societies, by human, I don't mean just it's not the human as an individual or the species. I mean humanization as in our relationship with the planet and re-entanglement. I think this transition is not complete. And so this is where I think what you're saying is absolutely spot on.
Yeah, and that psychological dimension of feeling that entanglement seems to me to be incredibly important, because, you know, in experiences where you feel oneself to be more than just this body bound individual, what we might kind of typically call spiritual experiences, there is this kind of recognition of that entanglement, right, and a moving beyond that siloing, and as you said, there's kind of divisions, categorizations, separations that we saw. You know, actually, if you go back to my grandparents' generation, half of them were either Jewish or Irish, and at that time, those groups weren't considered white, which sounds kind of incredible to me. That, you know, my grandparents could have, by today's standards, you would totally say they were white, but that's the level at which you can get to these fantasies of division and categorization, and all of this racialization. You know, is this fantasy, this overlay that's used to divide and so one can control, right? I think you pointed to this with the Enlightenment, with Francis Bacon and Descartes. You have this very explicit separation of subject and object, and so suddenly, whereas humans in indigenous communities seem to quite widely have this kind of animistic worldviews where they attribute subjecthood very widely, suddenly there's this proliferation of perceiving things to be objects. Suddenly everything in the natural world apart from us, or apart from maybe, you know, white men in particular, are less than this kind of elevated godly subject, and you no longer have to empathize with it, and you can do as you wish with it. And this even permeates today to the way we think about experience as this kind of disembodied computational thing that's very much away from being a kind of grounded living thing. And it's probably worth moving towards some of your actual, you know, so I spend a lot of time hand waving about these things in the way that I'm doing now, but the thing that I love about what you seem to be doing is you're really getting into the, yeah, I've heard you describe it as a kind of as a bureaucratic revolution or a boring revolution of kind of like, what is the actual kind of civic infrastructure? What kinds of relationships do we need to formalize, and in what ways that we need to make this not just something where we're hand waving and bemoaning the state of the world, but actually really tangibly finding a way to move forward.
Absolutely, and I think so. But I think it's really important, as you are doing, is to understand and recomprehend the philosophical base. And the other part I would say is that I don't want to give permission, but what I would say is, in a sense, science has gone through this Newtonian phase to a quantum phase and an entangled and feedback phase. So I would say that actually, you know, even through the lens of science, we are starting to see a different worldview emerging. And you know, if it was being cheap pop science, we would say we're moving from a Newtonian world to a quantum world, and we just haven't yet built the institutional frameworks for that quantum world, and we haven't understood, you know, even in language terms. So, you know, if we were really being honest, you know, we should probably all use the pronouns we, they, them. That would acknowledge the plurality that exists in us and our plurality as being a we function as opposed to an I function. And so, and I know that's not I think that's deeply understanding what it means to be human in that context, and that reframing. So this revolution is a revolution at that level. It's a revolution at the reimagination of those things. It's a revolution at the level of property, our theory of dominion and property rights. Should we, you know, what is our relationship to land? And should land be self-sovereign? Should it have its own agency in the world? So I think that's the other part, is that what we're seeing is technology and science are opening up paradigms to be able to construct new forms of synthetic agency and synthesizing agency. Because the difference between now and perhaps civilization models 500,000 years ago is that actually we are living at a planetary entanglement sense as opposed to just in the entanglement at bioregions or less. So what we have to then construct is new forms of actually expansion of our theory of agency. So moving from a worldview of assets and dead things to a worldview of agents and actors. And technology, whether it's kind of computational capabilities, are transforming our capacity to be able to understand and synthetically construct forms of agency. So when from a technology perspective, there was a kind of dream of the self-sovereign car or the car that could optimize itself. That's maybe 15 years away, 10 or 15 years away. But what we are seeing is that once you start to see the car not as an asset owned by a private limited company, but as an agent in the system, as a public good agent, we can construct that worldview. Or what we're designing is kind of imagining sort of what is traditionally called a surveillance camera into a care camera, where the surveillance is currently perceived surveillance because actually somebody can see through the panopticon and construct a panopticon worldview. But imagine if the care camera was actually discrete, it was an individual, it had visual learning to be able to look at a situation, but also trigger calls for help if help was required, whether it's an ambulance or police. Or you could access it with a digital warrant to ask it to release a particular form of information with a warrant which is stored. Now, in that format, that camera is no longer providing a panopticon view because nobody else has access to the information. It becomes a relationship of care to that situation and an obligation of care to that situation. So these kind of animistic expansions, now I've just described the kind of what I'd call the technological animistic expansions. You can then do it to river systems. So we're working around the world and sort of how do you reimagine the reanimism of a river. Now, do you do it? Traditional models are you put a single legal entity over the top of it. So you say, right, there's a legal entity, but that misunderstands the complexity of a relationships of a river. Rivers is a function of billions, if not trillions, of relationships. Yet if you apex it with a single entity, you create the bottleneck of information, and you create still the representative models of thinking. So let's imagine a river as an entanglement of emergent in boring terms, let's imagine a relationship as a billion contracts which have an emergent function to it, as well linked contracts which have an emergent function to it. So this animism of the river is a function of those aggregative relationships with the river that can be digitized. So, or even a forest which is self-sovereign, or even a house which we're doing, which is actually owns itself, to which we have a stewardship relationship with. So what we're seeing, and I think what we're starting to explore, is this expansion of expansion of the theory of agency and the expansion of that theory of agency to being and into beingness. And I think what we have is a boring revolution, which is a revolution of our bureaucratic capabilities as we move from analog systems. So analog systems would show a river drawing one way. It would be theoretically stable because we can only draw a stable system. In dynamic system, we can show the possibilities of that river and the different forms of relationships it opens up. So the move from analog to digital allows us to change theories of relationships. So it's not about fixed land, but relational access to that river. We can be generative in terms of those relationships, as opposed to quantitatively extractive. So the dynamic capabilities of bureaucracy is opening up the field for a kind of a new form of expansion of agency and also reimagination. I think this is it's at the apex of this quantum worldview with new bureaucratic capabilities that I think we can also transform the world around us. And that is, I think, the underlying problem space that we have to solve in many formats. And even a house that owns itself is a function of multiple relationships. The materials might be on a public trust. Well, they will be on a public trust. So entirely circulating, they're not owned by the house. The land might be self-sovereign, and you might have use rights. and stewardship rights to those relationships. So you are in stewardship rights with those materials as opposed to recognizing that they are yours, because who has the right to destroy soil? So I think these unbundling and rebundling of relationships is absolutely critical. But the centerpiece of this, returning back to where we became, is a recomprehension of ourselves and our way of being, kind of a new freedom, a new growth of our freedom to be in care, a freedom to be human, to be in care. Because I think currently we are like bad robots. We are caricatured as bad robots, and I think the meta problem that we're facing is that I think that wounding machine means that we're living in a perpetual war, which expands our theory of continuous trauma and our addictions in bad ways. So the question is, how do we build a great peace? How do we build a human capacity for moving into this other landscape of actually being able to be free to be in care? And then how do we build this institutional infrastructure and the expansion of agency and the institutional dynamics to be able to build this worldview?
You said so much that was amazing there. I think the rest of the conversation might just be me returning back over what you just said again and again, and unpacking different aspects of it. So to begin with, you referenced this phenomenon where, so there are, I think my knowledge of this is in the US, where there are Native American groups who hold rivers to be persons in their worldview, and there have been cases of successful rivers, forests, individual trees being granted personhood, or kind of a legal sovereign status, right? So in the same way that there are I have legal rights and you can't just kind of do whatever you want to me, if you can't just go and pollute in this river because it has protections, and you're pointing towards, that's a first step, but it's still, I guess it's still like an individual, and instead if we can harness technology to have this, as you say, a billion different kind of treaties where instead of relationships of ownership, where it's like, this isn't an object that you own and you have dominion over. Instead, this is a self-sovereign thing that has its own freedom that we can engage with in treaty, in a kind of consensual. I mean, you can't ask consent from the river, but an approximation of that, of kind of being in treaty with something. And so you're pointing towards using technology to result in emergent dynamics, kind of coming out of such a vast, complex web that accurately captures the true value in these systems, right? Because we're talking about, instead of value being something where it's all reduced down to just instrumental value of like, how much can I quantify, how much can I personally get out of this thing? Instead, there's a multiplicity of values, right, that emerges in any interaction, and trying to quantify that. So my question, I guess, is what's interesting in your perspective is, you embrace technology. There are strands of thinking that would sympathize with our critique, that are kind of anti-technology, kind of, and we've seen this throughout history, the Luddites, for example, people where the path is kind of felt to be, let's rewind the clock and move backwards into a simpler time, which I get the impression you think that's that's not going to happen, and that the solution is this, as a kind of technological animism. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't think there's a back. I mean, we have 8.2 billion people living on this planet. The only backward path is, as New Zealand found out during COVID, New Zealand doesn't produce a microchip. New Zealand doesn't produce aspirin. New Zealand doesn't produce vaccines. New Zealand doesn't produce PPPs. Yeah, this kind of illusion of isolationism as a kind of as a convenient retreat is just an illusion. I think the iPhone or the kind of iPads or the computers that we're sitting on, they are functions of 70 billion worth of humans over time, and they're functions of planetary capabilities. So we're living embodied in a new planetary capability. And I think what the challenge is that our planetary capabilities are constructed in an industrial mindset, which is no longer appropriate in a kind of planetary level entanglement. So we're moving from what I would call the worldview model, which goes, inner sort of the core, inner periphery, outer periphery, and the systems of extraction. So which are systems in that sense are asymmetric power, whereas to an entangled system, worldview, where actually the asymmetry no longer works. So I don't think there's a way back if I think we have environmentalists saying the carrying capacity of a billion of the Earth is a billion people. Um, the question I always have is for which lifestyle and for which billion, and who's going to make the sacrifice of the 7 billion? And do we genuinely think, with the availability of nuclear weapons, bioweapons, and other forms, that we will not drive a path toward mutually assured destruction once we enter that path? So the question, I think there is genuinely a problem space, which is, I think we have to enter a path of mutually assured thriving from this point onwards. There is no other path that actually reverses us to the point that we survive. That would be my conjecture. I'm happy for it to be challenged, but I'm having run scenarios, being in rooms, I'm pretty confident that that's the hypothesis that is the only available pathway to us. Off the back of that, then it throws up, how do we transform ourselves? And I think technology, our bureaucratic systems, remember the violence that we're living in is a violence of the analog. Our the property rights are not a digital phenomenon, they're an analog phenomenon. Our map systems are an analog phenomenon. Our classification theory is an analog phenomenon. Now, the question is, do we take those analog and replicate them into our digital paradigm, or can we make use of the dynamic computational capabilities of computers to enter a quantum age of bureaucracy, where actually you fractionalize it to the point that it transcends itself? And I think that is the invitation. So I think the invitation is, and if you were to marry that bureaucratic capability with the capacity for distributed decision and the reanimism of the world, a sort of synthetic reanimism of the world, I think we enter a worldview which rhymes at a planetary scale with an indigenous worldview. It rhymes. It's not the same, but it rhymes. And I think that's a function of, and that also requires a new rehumanization and a kind of vast investment in the planetary scale of the human development capacities of all of us. Now that will have to recode pretty much everything. And we already know this, right? 68% of our S&P 100, I think the stats are, is not viable if you totally priced in social and environmental costs. So we know our current industrial economic model is basically, it's basically the meteorite it has hit. The dinosaurs just don't know it yet. So we're going to see a vast level extinction of our current economic model. And we know that actually we're going to have to rebuild our food systems, we're going to have to rebuild our material economy, we're going to have to rebuild our energy systems, we're going to have to rebuild our relationship with biodiversity, we're going to have to rebuild our human development frameworks. And these are going to, I think, open up these pathways in exactly these ways. I think this is the new emancipation, like as we did, landowners were given power of democracy and agency to then expanded landowners beyond to include all men, and then we included some women, and we included all women, and we included all races, and we've been expanding that thesis of democracy. So this is the expansion of our theory of animism and agency in society to include non-human systems. And I think, and I would like to see a day when we talk about the population of the UK being X trillion life forms. And so we can start to reimagine our relationship in this whole plurality of life in itself, with all of these things coming together. So yeah, I mean, I think we are going to have to shift from analog modalities of an analog philosophy of thinking into a new theory of bureaucracy, which then opens up a capacity for new animism, new to be in treaty with, as we wrote, treaties with the land, to be in a new treaty with the world, which then I think creates a new class of value as we recode pretty much everything around us.
Yeah, and I think on the technology point, my feeling is that, I guess, even before we were Homo sapiens, we're harnessing fire as one of the earliest technologies, and ever since then, the idea of playing with fire, where it's something that's you're using it because it's powerful, because it extends your agency, and therefore it's also dangerous. I think that never stopped being relevant, and not just in the sense that we can cause harm with nuclear weapons and that kind of thing, but actually that I do think the use of technology, part of the downside of it is that it kind of intentionally the point of it really is to create some distance between the way the world is and what we're trying to do, so that we can augment our agency. But I think as long as we're aware of that, and we know that maybe that's a cost that's built in, that it has a tendency to push us in an alienated direction, and you correct for that, I think I don't see it being unsolvable.
So, yeah, I think you're right. I think one frame I would add is that do we other technology? And I think what we've done, and I would argue that this is just colloquialism, but you know, it, since the 1970s, which I think was a mass in the transition from a elite individualism mindset to a universal individualism mindset, in the kind of 70s, as the kind of capital system took root. We have also othered technology, certainly from a Western perspective. And the othering of technology and the separation of technology from us, whereas other cultures like Japan haven't created this othering of technology. They see it as a symbiosis. And so if we re-entangle in technology, not other it, and I think that there's a reason why we see the dystopian technological worldviews emerging since the 70s onwards in Western science fiction and literature, is because in the othering, it becomes a landscape of fear. And in the landscape of fear, it becomes a kind of a sort of a source of fear, worry, othered power, and it creates the permission of it becoming a power system in itself, a place of violence to us. And I think the kind of philosophical question is how do we de-other our relationship with technology and start to become accepting in our cybernetics and cyber symbiosis in a way of technology, and it should be a cyber ecological symbiosis, because I think it's a machine human ecological evolution that we're in the middle of. And so I think there's a kind of philosophical cultural question for me, which is that's why I think we've ended up with a worldview with technology is almost we have othered it, it's then become dystopian, and then we've capitalized it in the act of making it, and it's become a creature of capital and an extractive creature, part of the extension of the wounding machine. And I think we have to deeply reimagine that if we're going to do that. Not every culture has taken that worldview. That's the other thing. And I think there's something really critical about reimagining that relationship if we're going to actually have a symbiotic relationship with these frames.
Yeah, I think it's, to me, our use of technology seems to be a defining feature of our species, even more than our ability to know, that it's actually kind of coded in our Homo sapien Latin name. And so the continuum of technology, as I say, even before we were Homo sapiens, our use of our ancestors of technology feels like it's a false dichotomy, as you say, to distance ourselves from it and say it's something we have the option to use or not use. So no, I definitely sympathize with that. And the use of it, it feels like the crucial to this view is that, speaking of our ability to know, the way we often think about things is we come up with a mental model of a fixed static image of the way things are and a plan, and we say like, this is how it is, and we're going to execute on that. And it feels like your kind of way of doing things feels more like a kind of organismic, evolving, learning, emergent way of being, as a kind of ongoing exploration instead of fixed ideas. Is that a fair way to characterize it?
Yeah, and I think so. If you are working in complexity, everything is made available through you in an adjacent possible. And also, most of your learning of comprehending the adjacent possible is in an act of craft. So learning craft and the exploration of the adjacent possible is an unfurling capacity. And I think whereas most of our industrial thinking would be projective, linear, and target orientated. So I think that this kind of unfurling capacity and learning capacity and to operate in care and adjacencies is actually fundamental. Now, the real challenge it sets up is our theories of capital are all based on linear projection. Our theories of allocation are linear projections. So it really does open up some really fundamental questions of, as we explore in complexity, how do we resource the landscapes to be able to do that? And I think that's a really interesting question for for many people who are resourcing into this future. And I think that's going to be a really interesting question. So, and that also requires you to shift power in an organization from CEOs to chief learning officers, because actually the learning, creating the compounding learning capacity of the organization is the coherence function as opposed to the control function. So you go from, coherence from control, coherence to learning. And then it also builds a different form of kind of citizenship it requires, because in a way, leadership is at the edge of the system as opposed to actually at the center of a system. So it changes where leadership exists, and then it also requires different theories of um, of pay even. So traditionally, we accrue pay through a theory of management and control. Well, what does pay look like in a theory of unfoldment and actually leadership at the edge of a system? How do you what does that look like? So I think these you're absolutely right. That's what we're trying to do. Um, and but it has all these cascading impacts on how you organize into that reality. Yeah.
Yeah, I love your use of the term the adjacent possible. So, for people not familiar with it, it's a term from complexity theory, right? Where a good example would be ants finding food. There's no central planning. The queen ant doesn't send out messages of where to go to look, but instead there's this noise where ants wander off in random directions, and then when they find food, certain emergent dynamics build up, and they redirect their attention there. So there's this empowerment that comes with decentralization, where, as you say, the edges are the ones feeling and learning and finding where opportunities are, where possibilities are adjacent to where you're currently kind of occupying. And so something we're used to kind of trade-offs between things, right? Where if someone tells you they've got like a solution that's going to fix everything and it's all going to be great, that inherently kind of produces skepticism. And so I think the world that I think we both can imagine, someone might hear it in that way, that it feels kind of too good to be true, because it's like, not only do we solve all of these systemic issues, but actually we're freer, we're living in harmony, we're flourishing. You take something like regenerative farming, like your food's more nutritious, like all of these positive things can happen. But for me, it's, you make sense of that by basically, you use the word symptom early on when you're talking about carbon. We're currently kind of in a state of illness as a system. And if someone's very ill and there's something wrong with them, and the doctor says, we can correct the illness and the symptoms will go away and you'll feel better, we don't look at that with skepticism. We understand how organisms can move towards a state of health and flourishing, and things can become aligned and harmonious. And so that feels like a good analogy here for our current situation. And so, we started the conversation kind of diagnosing where we're currently at. And I think that's a necessary thing to do, is to kind of help people to kind of wake up to our current situation, because there's so much suffering, and there's a lot of, generally our civilization feels like it's in the dark. And I'm sure you're used to kind of having these conversations with people who see the problem, but on most of civilization isn't having this conversation, as far as I can see. And there is a genuine confusion and a genuine kind of feeling around that leads to politics lurching towards kind of regressive, authoritarian directions, because people just want some simple solution, some simple narrative. And so there's this, to move into this future, I guess, what is the path that you see? What I think it's wonderful, these theories being brought into existence. And I guess my concern is, if everyone if we already had the care in place for everyone to be emotionally grounded and well regulated, and to be able to engage from a rational place, then people could just look at this and say, oh, this totally makes sense. It aligns with what we know scientifically about the world and could lead to a better world. But we're not seeing that at the moment. Do you have hope there that people could kind of just come to these ideas and think like, yes, we'll have an enlightenment where this makes sense and this is the world we want to see?
So if I'm really honest, one side of me is there's no choice, right? So if we choose life, and if life wants to live, let's use the Jurassic Park kind of deep thought. I don't think we have a choice. However, as you rightly say, I think people are actually trapped. People feel viscerally trapped. People feel wounded to the point of paralysis. And I think there is a genuine feel of entrapment. And to make this journey, we're going to have to make a journey of of building the capacities of people in society to be able to make that whole journey. And I think that's a really big issue. And that's why I think we often talk about the technologies of decarbonization, but we don't talk about the kind of technologies and the investments of human development, which are going to be required to be able to make this journey and create the healing to be able to create those capacities. And at this moment in time, everything I will say is an increased in the labor of being, right? In a way, to be in care will feel like labor, will feel like an extension of people that are overworked, people that are over instrumentalized, and we're saying now you've got to be even more attentive. And so the question is, this is quite challenging what we're saying, and there is a kind of transition because actually we are increasing the burden on one side. At the same, but this is a dynamic that we all need to shift, and I think this is a dynamic shift that occurs in both seeing the possible. But one thing I would say is that, you know, I've given many public talks. I think people can perceive the violence already in their world around them. They can perceive their violence to the world. They can perceive the violence that the world does to them. So, you know, we may have this conversation, but I think this, you know, we are giving words to things people are feeling already. And I think to give those words to be able to people to recognize they're living at war and to then create the space of what is a great peace for our age? How do we construct a great peace? Actually has resonance. People can feel that journey. Now, I think the pathway of doing that is going to be multiple in transition. Some of these things are going to come at us in different ways. So, you know, you could argue the Industrial Revolution in the UK happened because educational reform had happened 50 years prior. So, what is our equivalent of the human development investments that we're going to need to make? What is the equivalent of actually there will be anti-fragility and there will be fragility in the system, which will cause transitions of food systems to happen and different pathways to happen. And if our industrial economic system needs to be rebooted, how do we build those new human capacities? So some of these things are going to come at us. Some of the things we're going to have to build the capacity to deal with. And I think these are the kind of transitions that we're facing. But in no way would I say this is I think where we get to is extraordinary, but I think the journey is both messy, complicated, and will also have real toll on people, and will be an invitation of toll as we go from one landscape of the world to a different landscape. So I don't say this without any sense of this is a difficult journey and will invite labor as we move from one to the other state.
Right, and I think so I've often sat with that feeling of like moving into this direction requires people, not only requires more care work for people, but also emotional vulnerability. I think being held accountable, an emotion, kind of rawness and openness instead of shutting off and claiming things to be kind of fixed in a certain way and that you're separate and all of that stuff. And you may kind of say, why, if you're asking people to do more work, to feel emotionally raw, like why would people do this? And then kind of by analogy, the answer I kind of came up with is, well, if I look at my home life, I live in a respectful, way with my partner and my family, where I choose to do that, despite the fact that it requires me to take a share in the housework. It requires me to be emotionally open and vulnerable. But that's possible because there's care and respect there, and I know I'm not going to be exploited through that vulnerability. Still means, at times the vulnerability can be challenging. But what's the other option is, to the rational mind that's sufficiently dissociated from feeling, you could say, oh, why not be emotionally violent? Why not be physically violent? Then you won't have to do the washing up. You won't have to be emotionally open. But to anyone who's in a privileged enough situation to be able to feel into that, that's horrifying. And so we know we want flourishing and harmony, and it's worth the price of the labor, both physical and emotional. Once you're inhabiting it, it's obvious what is flourishing and harmony and what is good. But unfortunately, because of a dearth of care, there are people who choose that, don't consciously choose it, but who live in that way of domination, of violence, because they don't have the possibility to kind of to live in a kind of loving, respectful, free way with other people.
Absolutely. And in a way, and to be able to, we live in a society where we value opinion as opposed to the capacity to hold uncertainty, right? What do you think of this? As opposed to, how do we hold uncertainty in society? We expect our leaders to give us certainty or the illusion of certainty, and then we tell them off for lying. But the reality is, it is an illusion of certainty. To hold uncertainty is actually the gift. And I would say science, in its purest sense, was the means for society to hold uncertainty. It wasn't a truth engine. It was an uncertainty holding engine. It was a means to continuously hold uncertainty and let it unfold. And certainty was an unfurling as opposed to a truth. And we've lost the ability, this is I think, the household creates a framework exactly for this economy of care, uncertainty, and vulnerability. And I think the question is, how do we as societies build that expansion of holding uncertainty, care, and vulnerabilities? And then to kind of put the ointment, put the little needle in the stack, though, I would say that, the question is, how do we deal with defense, security? And this is why I think this has got to be a geopolitical conversation. This has to be talking about a great peace at a planetary scale. Because whilst we maintain the theory of we maintain this violence fractals all the way from between countries to between organizations and all the way through. So we're going to have to look at what does a great peace at a planetary scale look like, and we're certainly going to have to look at actually what is our war machine in the 21st century, and how do you construct that war machine in the 21st century, and what does it mean? And I think we have to start to think quite fundamentally about that at a deep level. What does a digital war machine look like? What does an autonomous war machine look like? How will we transcend from a kind of a non-human war machine to a world without the war machine? So I think there's a kind of journey here that we won't just get rid of everything instantly.
Yeah, and I think a nice thing about this perspective is that, talking about ending the kind of the war machine is probably, one of the grandest kind of things one could aspire to achieve, in the sense that it seems so kind of unattainable at the moment. But there's a through line all the way down to, as you say, in the household, in the individual's life, into how, our society is made up of it's running on people, right? And so if those people, if each person kind of can go on this journey even a little bit, it's biasing the system towards an emergent dynamic where this becomes normalized and becomes the kind of the flourishing that we would hope to see. Is that if someone's inspired by listening to this to kind of get involved, in quotes, or kind of do something in this direction, I guess I would say I think that inner work piece is important, as well as the outer work piece of coming up with ways to provide care for people. But where would you point people towards?
I think exactly as you said, that this is, I think some of this stuff, like I said before, I think this is a fork, not a spectrum, between mutually assured destruction and mutually assured thriving. And I think this is a journey, it's a fractal journey. This is why you could argue that even democracies and market economies knew that market economies could only survive if you could marketize the whole world. Because as soon as you got asymmetric power, actually markets were secondary functions. So as soon as you got authoritarian power. So I think unless we can construct the great peace, it is impossible to actually remove the theory of violence in the system and the wounding machine in its framework. But it does build itself up, as you rightly say, all the way through. And it's also recognizing that that is probably our only way of mutually assured thriving, and to recognize our entanglement. So it's a fractal journey. And I think what's interesting is that it may almost be plausible to say it, let alone do it. But even the permission to say, well, actually, this could be a journey we could be on as humanity. And this could be James Lovelock in Nova Scene sort of talks about the planet becoming conscious. And this may be a moment where the planet itself becomes self-aware. By planet, I mean machine, human, ecological systems at the whole planetary scale through the computation capabilities, but also awareness of life and expansion of agency. There's a new form of civilization, I don't want to even say, but planetary consciousness being born as a function of that. But that requires this transcendence all the way through. We have to work our way through that journey.
I think you're totally right to frame it as a kind of fractal theory of change, because fractal structures emerge, this self-similarity, we have similar patterns at different scales. They seem to emerge at phase transitions where there needs to be coordination across all these different scales. So when water freezes, it's no good if it just freezes at the atomic level and that no corresponding structures kind of happen at larger scales. The reason we get snowflakes with these self-similar structures is because that's the mathematics of how patterns resonate kind of across these different scales. And as we're pointing to the kind of the family, the individual kind of dyadic relationship between two individuals, and all the way up to our global civilization, I do see similarities, or I think you can use this idea of rhyming earlier. I think there are rhymes there. They're not exactly the same, but there are similar patterns. And so if you've got the individuals who constitute society seeing the world a different way to the current system, and genuinely believing and living from that place, it's kind of hard to see how it doesn't resonate up, or how the existing control order can live on top of that base.
I think you're right, but it's worth recognizing that the family unit existed in history. However, what we created was all our institutional logics in a theory of through the theory of kings, I would argue. Our institutional logics were constructed through the theory of kings and queens. They were domination of power systems, because that was, the perspective was birth of kings' view on the world. The objectification was actually a distancing, the kind of all of that stuff was actually part of the journey. And the classification was actually a means to put order to allow for visibility, seeing like a state and all those things. So the question is, how do we build those institutional frameworks from the kind of household up, where the domination of care and holding of uncertainty and permissioning vulnerability and the exploration of adjacent possibles and resources, this new framework is through which we build this institutional capability. And I think you're absolutely right that there is just a recognition that our institutional logics made us, unless we recode those, our theory of property, our theory of money production, centralized money production. These are all means of orchestration and allocation from the view of kings and queens. And I think that's the real deep democracy. And we've been living in that age. We've had the synthetics of democracy in a way, but in a way, a prime minister is a sort of a king with a 5-year term, right? It's still centralized in their capability worldviews. And so the question is, how do we really deeply pivot that to build that worldview, as we discussed, uncertainty, care, vulnerability, creativity, complex cognition, deeply rooted in the everyday, and the embodied sense of that interbeing relationship and expansion of agency into those fields as well.
Yeah, no, that totally fits. The language there, even thinking about kings, fits with this fractal point where we think about patriarchs, about the kind of patriarchy of the kind of the father figure leading the people, and that obviously arises from this household image of the kind of the violent patriarch, the dominating father, and it's easy to see in a world. I doubt Vladimir Putin goes home and is a very kind of open, vulnerable, kind of person in his family life. I'm sure there's a corresponding dynamic in terms of how people show up at this larger societal scale, and their desire to dominate and be hierarchical and to live life in that way. So I think intervening at that level feels a lot more tangible than trying to go straight after the war machine, whereas it actually feels possible to help to influence people to move in that direction. And it's a direction we want to move in. I genuinely believe people don't choose to be violent for the sake of it. They often are doing it out of desperation, out of stress, out of lack of care. And something about, the kind of the neuroscience of it is a hopeful place to intervene is, there are situations where there actually isn't a lack of care, where someone's partner may be theoretically supportive and open, but because of their historic traumas, they're projecting, they see through the lens of those, this is the kind of the Bayesian brain idea that we see what we expect to see. So there's this interpretation based on past stresses and traumas and emotional challenges where there's a kind of pessimistic bias. And so people are living in often unnecessarily individualized, separate, dominating dynamics. And so just to share, part of my kind of passion is that, we're seeing with things like psychedelic medicine, opportunity to really intervene there and help with healing traumas. And I think that could be a useful component in moving the world in this direction.
I agree. I think it's a full stack response in that sense. And you're right to say it's, some of this may be the bias formation that we enter our relationships with and dialogue with. So as much as it is the true impacts of trauma and the residual effects, and also the continuous wounding capacity, and then the institutional reinforcements and the language reinforcements, our language is being noun orientated as opposed to verb orientated, that creates a persistent bias in how we orientate in the world. So there's a kind of a whole stack of these transformations which are very cultural, and then our theory of property, and all of that stuff is building a stack that's actually deeply persistent, and that's what's maintaining the current status quo, and it requires unwinding in that sense in everyday experiences.
This has been very kind of high level, big picture conversation, and I've absolutely loved it. But the projects you've actually worked on are fascinating. Like you mentioned briefly earlier, the kind of open house, like a self-owning house, and in your radical civics work, you speak about this idea of a care forest. And so before we go, I wonder if you'd want to share any more kind of specific, tangible things that you've been working on, because I just think they're really fascinating.
Yeah, no, I think one of the big things for us is that this transformation requires an everyday transformation. I think we often think about transformation and it's the transformation of the house, right? So theories of property, theories of materiality, ownership of materiality, ownership of soil, our relationship of stewardship. So what we're really focused on is the transformation of everyday things, which is, whether it's a kind of surveillance camera turning into a care camera, or the house, or even the street light, or even the urban forest, and how do you have a relationship of care? We know that an urban forest which has been planted by communities has a 90% chance of survival versus one planted by the state or municipality. So we know theories of care are really critical. So how do you build an institutions for multi-currency things, but where the act of love is as important as the act of money, and these are two forms of currency. So how do you construct these everyday things, and all the way through to river systems, all the way through to the mental health of a city, or the new theory, we're building material registries. But how do you build a material registry for a city in a different way, and how does that change our economy of materials, not through ownership, but a new theory of stewardship? So what we're looking at is all these codes of the everyday, and reframing not just the everyday experience, but the bureaucratic infrastructures of those things. And as you rightly say, for us, this is a fractal moment where if people can experience a new way of being, I think that expands the thesis of what is provided in a loving house to a wider environment, a place-based environment, which thereby creates the pathways for new envisionings of the future beyond. So for us, that has been a key part of our work, and that's really what we're doing. And then, obviously looking at the key institutions, property, all the way through to monetary formation, because they and the contract. So the contract and the treaty. How do you turn the contract into a dynamic treaty relationship? How do you imagine theories of property, evolving theories of property from ownership to self-ownership to embodied ownership models, and then theories of monetary and resource formation, because they need to be reimagined together behind the and underneath the everyday. And rooted in that is this idea of creating this animistic agency capacity through a theory of interbeing, not individualism, not discreteness, but interbeing agencies. And that's really what we're trying to do. And people can read a lot about people can read a lot about it in our blogs, and we publish quite a lot, try to be transparent and really encourage people to help make us smarter, critique us better, and make us stronger. And hopefully, we can also provide better work and contributions.
And is that where you would send people to if they want to look into the work more, the blog?
Yeah, I mean, provocations that don't matter, or have a look at our website. Feel free to get in touch with us. I mean, we're open. We want to get better. Question us. We're part of a. Nothing we do is just us. We're part of a whole body of knowledge and agents around the world that are working together. So yeah, definitely have a look at the website. Get in touch.
Great. I'll put a link for the Dark Matter Labs website in the description. And thank you again, Indy. This has been wonderful.
A real pleasure, James. Thank you for hosting these sort of conversations. They're really important, the kind of linking of the philosophical and the science and the kind of materially possible. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it too. Thanks. Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.